Thank you, Cole, for reading that. We are going to skip the introduction and just jump right into our study for this evening. I'd encourage you to keep a marker in 1 Samuel. And what we're going to do this evening, we can't do this every lesson, but I feel like this is an important time to do this in our reading as we're reading through the Old Testament in a year. But what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to zoom out, look at the big picture of God's people, the nation of Israel so far. Then we're going to zoom into chapter 8, which I believe is one of the most influential and important chapters in all of the New Testament that dictates the trajectory of the nation of Israel. And then what we're going to do at the end is we're going to zoom out and look forward at the next few books in our reading and just kind of see how this chapter plays out into a much, much bigger story. To start this evening, our lesson is going to be based mostly out of 1 Samuel chapter 8, but like I said, we're going to zoom out. And I want you to think all the way back to the beginning of God's people, back in with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, God speaks to Abraham and makes some promises to him. There's several promises involved in that conversation and with God and Abraham. But there's three main ones that are kind of repeated throughout the story of God's people. The first of that is that God promises to Abraham, I will give you a land. He says that in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. But we see just over in verse 5 of that same chapter that Abraham arrives in the land of Canaan. But he's not a blessing to all people yet. God promises to Abraham, I will make you a great nation. And this is fulfilled in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, partially, where God's people, they're having so many babies, and they're turned into a great nation. There's so many people in that nation. And then the third main promise that we usually talk about is the blessing to all. God promises to Abraham, I will make you a blessing to all nations. And this is seen to be fulfilled in Genesis chapter 41, verses 56 and 57. And this is when Joseph is in Egypt. Joseph has risen to second in command in Egypt, and because of the wisdom that God has given him, people are coming from all over the world to come to Egypt to get food from there because of God's wisdom through Joseph. But they're not a great nation yet. As you can see with these three promises, there has been limited fulfillment in each of those passages up there, but there hasn't been an ultimate fulfillment. There hasn't been a time where all of these have come together all at the same time. And so the story continues. God delivers the people from Egypt to Canaan. This is one of these significant moments in the history of God's people. You know the story of the 10 plagues. God sends on Egypt and Pharaoh, and eventually God's people are led out of the land. They're led through the Red Sea, and they wander in the wilderness. But God delivers the people from Egypt to Canaan. That's a very significant point in the history of God's people. Exodus from Egypt is the book of Exodus. They're wandering in the wilderness in the book of Numbers, and they inherit the land of promise in Joshua. And then, during that same time, during the wandering in the wilderness, while they're in near Sinai, God provides the law of Moses, another very significant point in the history of God's people. And this is mostly recorded in Leviticus. There's a few things in purity laws and things like that, the Nazirite vow in Numbers, and then a lot of that is retold in Deuteronomy by 5 speeches of Moses. These are all significant moments in the history of God's people. And then, as we've talked about, we enter the period of Judges. So this is after they've entered into the land of their promise, but they just start into this downward spiral that you know so well. They call out to God, and God delivers them, and they obey for a little bit because God has appointed a judge over them, but then they fall away, and God sends them into captivity of a nation. A nation comes and rules over them, and then they cry out to God, and the cycle is just repeated and repeated. And one of the themes throughout the second half of the book of Judges is there's a phrase that's repeated 4 times in chapter 17, 18, 19, and 21. And that phrase is, in those days there was no king in Israel. So as we can see here, even though Judges seems to be a really dark time for God's people, they're in the land of promise, but one of the themes of Judges, it seems like they're waiting for something. Judges points to the need for a king. And so when we arrive in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we're still in that period of the Judges. Read with me in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. Now it came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah, and they were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain, and they took bribes and perverted justice. So we've kind of surveyed the big picture. Now we're zooming in, and the scene is that Samuel, who was the last of the judges that God appointed, is now starting to get old. Samuel's starting to get old, and we see in verse 1 that he appointed his sons. There's two problems that we read just in these first three verses that kind of show a spiritual decline happening in Israel. Number one, Samuel's sons are acting wickedly. Specifically, they were turning aside after dishonest gain, and they're taking bribes and perverting justice. But the second problem with that is Samuel seems to be tolerating it. Samuel doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. Samuel has actually been the one who appointed his sons. In the book of Judges, the picture that we see is God is always the one who appoints the judges. Now, Samuel here starts trying to do this dynasty thing and ends up appointing his own sons, and it doesn't seem like he had any authority for that. And so Samuel appoints his sons, they're acting wickedly, and Samuel tolerates it and doesn't seem to be doing anything about it, which was a big problem. If you look with me in Deuteronomy chapter 16, we're going to be going back to Deuteronomy a couple times throughout this, so I'd encourage you to keep a marker in 1 Samuel there. But in Deuteronomy chapter 16, Moses is being told about the judges that are to be appointed. So Moses' father-in-law is encouraging him, hey, get some help with what you're doing. And so what's told to him in verse 18, it says this: "You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes." Notice this: "And they shall judge the people with a righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not be partial, and you shall not take a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the word of the righteous." One kind of interesting theme that's going on here in the book of 1 Samuel is Samuel was raised by Eli, who was the judge before him. And Eli had a problem with his sons, if you remember, Hophni and Phinehas. They were significantly worse from what we read than Samuel's sons were. But it's pretty disappointing that we see Samuel following in this pattern of not properly disciplining and raising his sons, and it just kind of keeps going. And so what we see in verses 4 and 5 of 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you want to go back in the text there, it says in verse 4 that all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. What's kind of happening here is it seems like these elders are representing the people. It's almost like maybe like a state representative or something like that. So all the people are talking, and they seem to go to the elders, and then all the elders go and talk to Samuel. And this is what they say to Samuel. They say to Samuel, "Samuel, you've gotten old, and your sons don't walk in your ways. Now, appoint us a king to judge us like all the nations." Stop right there for just a moment. Now, the wickedness of Samuel's sons is not the source of the request that these elders make. The elders make a request, give us a king. We want a king. And it doesn't necessarily seem like Samuel's sons are the source of this request, but it does open the door for Israel's request. You've seen things like that before, maybe in business or in school, where something happens and the people had already been feeling one way about something, how maybe things should have been going, how maybe the leadership should have been doing things. But then when something finally happens, well, that just opens the door to bring up all these different problems and issues. And so that's what seems to happen in these verses here. So as we look at this next section in verse 6 here, verse 6 says this, "But the matter was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord." Now we're going to look in more detail in just a second at the details of the elders of Israel's request. We're going to look at that because I think it reveals a lot of psychology about how we think about things, how the people were thinking about things, and I think there's a lot to be learned from it. But jump to the end and look at how Samuel reacts in verse 6. Samuel prays to God. Samuel doesn't like what the elders are saying. It actually says that the matter of them bringing this up was displeasing in the sight of Samuel. Why might that be? Well, because Samuel was in charge. Samuel had put his sons in charge. He wasn't doing everything right. Obviously, he was allowing his sons to continue their wicked ways, but he did do this right. Samuel went and brought his discomfort, his displeasure about the situation to God. It seems like Samuel honestly might have been personally hurt. Wouldn't you be if you were in Samuel's position? Why do you think, though, that he brought it to God? Well, it's because he was frustrated. He brought his frustrations to God. He was possibly personally hurt, and God hears him. God hears his prayer and provides some comfort to him in the following verses, but then also answers Israel's request. But I want us to just kind of hang out there on their request for a moment. In verses 4 and 5, Israel makes the request for a king. And I want us to think for a moment, what was wrong with their request? What was wrong with the request that they made for a king? Well, there's a few different ideas here, and let me just kind of put this first one up here. Some people think that the one reason that it was wrong that they asked this was because they were asking for a king at all. Now, we know, we'll read this in a second, but we know from God's response in verses 7 and 9 that the matter was also displeasing to God. God wasn't pleased with the request that Israel had made. However, just the fact of saying, we want a king, I don't know if that's necessarily what was wrong with the request. If you think back to Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, this is in Jacob speaking to Judah and blessing his sons, and this is the promise that says, the scepter shall never depart from Judah. Well, what kind of person holds a scepter? A king, right? So it seems like there's some picture already of a king all the way back in Genesis when talking with Jacob's sons. Additionally, in 1 Samuel chapter 2, this is in Hannah's song responding to God for giving her Samuel. Hannah was Samuel's mother, and she was so excited to have Samuel, and so there's this song that's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And in verse 10, the idea of a king is mentioned. It talks about God giving strength to this king. So this idea of a king was something that had already been around in previous texts. It's in Genesis as we saw, it's in 1 Samuel chapter 2, but look back at Deuteronomy chapter 17, and I think this reveals a little bit more about the situation. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, starting in verse 14, it says this, "When you enter the land which your Lord God gives you," this is Moses speaking to the people, "when you enter the land and you possess it and live in it, and you say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me,' you shall surely You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as a king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. We'll look at a couple more verses in that text here in just a moment. But just the idea of wanting a king doesn't necessarily seem to be the problem. I don't think we can pinpoint that as the problem with their requests, because it's in Genesis, Samuel, and back in Deuteronomy there's a king mentioned. Well, what about the second phrase? We want a king like the other nations. Can we advance the slide? There we go. Like the other nations. Is that the phrase that's a problem? We know back in Exodus chapter 19, when God is talking to the people, God is saying to them, you will be a people for my own possession. You will be a nation of priests. You will be a holy nation. But, as we saw with the text in Deuteronomy, that same phrase is used. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14, that same phrase is used. I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. So they could make the excuse, back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, they could make the excuse that, well, we're just quoting the law of Moses. We're just doing what God planned for us originally. We're just doing the like the other nations, the political station of the king. I mean, that's in the law of Moses. So they could kind of, just issue that as an excuse. It could be that that's what they're referring to when they make that request. But we see in God's response, in verses 7 through 9, that we'll read in just a moment, that God says, they have rejected me. Something about their request, maybe not necessarily the words, but maybe their heart, is what's the problem with this request. Read with me verses 7 through 9. The Lord responds to Samuel as Samuel prays to him, and God says this, listen to the voice of the people. That same phrase is used in verse 9. But it says, listen to the voice of the people regarding all that they say to you, because they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have abandoned me and served other gods, so they are doing to you as well. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall warn them strongly and tell them of the practice of the king who will reign over them. God says they have rejected me. And I want you to notice the king that God describes back in Deuteronomy 17. I know we're bouncing around, but let me just read the rest of how God describes the king that he will appoint. Look at verse 17. Deuteronomy 17:17 says this. Well, verse 16 says this. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. Now, it shall come about that when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, by carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he and his sons may continue long in his kingdom in the midst of Israel. That's the king God intended. A humble king. A king that's not so focused on monetary power. A king that's not focused on horses for some reason, which I guess, the Kentucky Derby was this weekend. But don't multiply your horses. Don't multiply your wives. It's going to lead you astray. All these things are the instructions that God gave for a king that was supposed to be over Israel. And I want you to see the description that's given back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 10. So Samuel goes and talks with God. God responds to him, and we'll dissect that here more in just a moment. But this is the warning that God gives Samuel to give the people. In verse 10, Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked him for a king. In verse 11, and he said this. This is the warning. This is the king that's being proposed. Verse 11, this will be the practice of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and put them in chariots for himself and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to do his plowing. Skip down to verse 13. He will also take your daughters and use them as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. Verse 14. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. Verse 15. And he will take a tenth of your seed and your vineyards and give it to his high officials and his servants. Verse 16. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. Verse 17. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Was there a certain phrase that seemed to be emphasized throughout the reading of that text there? If you didn't notice, the phrase he will take is used 6 times in this text. God constantly describes this king that they are wanting for some reason. A king like the other nations is a king that does what? Is a king that takes. And in verses 19 and 20, look what happens. In verses 19 and 20, the people refuse to listen to the warning of Samuel, and look at what they say. They say, no, but there shall be a king over us, so that we may be like all the nations, and our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, after what we read in verses 10 through 18, he will take, 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 he will take. They had the opportunity of saying, no, Samuel, that's not what we want. We want a king like God said. We want a king like what was back in Deuteronomy 17, even though they didn't have chapter divides back in. We want a king like that, not like a king that will just take from us and make us his servants. They had the opportunity to say, no, that's not what we want. Give us a king after God's own heart. But they say, no, that's what we want. And so the question I want us to spend some time really sitting on and thinking about is this. Why? Why would they choose a king like this? Why would they decide to choose a king that takes instead of a king that gives and a king that listens? Why is it that they were doing that? Israel ultimately was seeking a substitute for God. They believed that there were alternatives that could deliver them. One commentator I read puts it this way, and I think this is right. Israel's request is fundamentally just a new idolatry. It's simply the old idolatry with a new twist. If you notice, back in God's conversation with Samuel, back in verses 7 and 8, God says, they have rejected me as king over them. God was supposed to be their king. And so by requesting something other than God, they are choosing idolatry. Israel's decision is one away from the Lord and towards a substitute. It's a turn from the living God towards an idol. A turn from the living God's people and towards living like slaves back in Egypt. If you notice, that's the comparison that God uses back in verse 8. He compares what they're doing, their request, to being like back in Egypt. This is the problem with Israel's request. This is what the Lord is responding to in verses 7 and 8. Israel is tempted to return to the slavery of Egypt because they did not believe that the Lord would provide and fight their battles. That's what they were seeking after. And if you remember, back when they're wandering in the wilderness, what's their wish? Oh, that we would just go back to Egypt. There, we ate the good stuff back there. Do you not remember? Do you not remember the slaves that you were? This is what we see in this text here, is that Israel is tempted to return to the slavery of Egypt because they did not believe that the Lord would provide and fight their battles. And as is usually the case, Israel in the days of Samuel was not unique in this tendency. They're not the only ones who act like this and make requests like this. Don't we too have the same problem? We too are tempted to return to the slavery of our old idols because we do not believe that the Lord will provide and fight our battles. And this can be true both on a corporate level as a church and also as an individual. But this evening I want us to ask ourselves the question, what does it look like when we doubt that the Lord will fight our battles and provide for our deepest needs? What does that look like? In a book titled Counterfeit Gods, written by Tim Keller, he points out that beneath all of our idols, beneath all the substitutes to God that we pursue and devote ourselves to, there's usually one or more of what he calls deep idols that we are really pursuing when we're looking for some alternative to God. And the four common deep idols that he outlines in this book are this: security, comfort, power, and approval. I'll repeat those just so you remember them. But security, comfort, power, and approval. Every human being craves these four things, whether you realize it or not. Most of us have one or two of those specifically that we really crave, that we are terrified even of just not having. We are crippled by the idea of not having some of these cravings, and so we get so worried about it that we are tempted to give ourselves over to all sorts of other idols in our lives. Which of those four idols, those deep idols that I listed off, do you feel like you crave after most? Which motivates you the most? Which one do you worry the most about not having? Think about Israel for a moment in regards to those four needs. For Israel, it was what? It was security. At the end of those verses they're wanting a king that will go out for us and fight our battles. They felt like they needed someone to fight their battles and protect them, and they were afraid that they wouldn't have that security with God. Which is ironic because in the chapter before, in 1 Samuel 7, we see God delivering the people from the Philistines. What is it for you, though? What is it that you desire so much that you are willing to serve some other God, some other thing, as something as if it were Yahweh? What is the deep idol that you desire so much that you are willing to serve it like a slave in order to get it? Israel here, because of the idolatrous form of the monarchy that we see Israel is requesting, is a type of slavery. The warning that they receive is that you will be made his servants. And that is the way that it most resembles returning to Egypt. Israel is willing to sacrifice their sons and daughters, their fields, their food, their servants, their livestock, for the protection that they think this kind of king will give them. They're willing to give them his whole selves. They're willing to give up everything about themselves. And Samuel says directly to them, as we've seen, you will be his slaves. They are willing to return to the slavery that the Lord had delivered them from in order to feel more secure. And the fact is, we can be a lot like that sometimes. We all have our sins that we just can't let go of. Maybe if you became a believer later in life, then it's the thing that you thought would give you security for all your life, give you comfort, give you power, give you approval before you knew the Lord. Maybe if you grew up on the pew, it's the thing that has always called to you from outside these walls, calling you to trust it instead of trusting God. That thing that claims to give you real security, real comfort and pleasure, real power, real approval and acceptance. And sometimes, even after we've come to faith in Christ, when we've come to know the Lord, much like Israel in our text this evening, we find that same fear again that we will lose what we most crave. Whichever one of those four idols that it is, security, comfort, power, or approval, and we begin to doubt that God will provide for us. And we begin to think about these idols. We begin to obsess over these idols. Slavery all of a sudden seems appealing again, even though God has set us free. But of course, we know those idols have no true power. Those idols that we so crave will never give us what they actually promise. So the question tonight is, what does the slavery of Egypt look like for you? What are the things that cause you to get desperate for security, comfort, power? And can those things that you're chasing after really give you what you're looking for? The answer that we see in 1 Samuel is that whatever you're craving, God is the only actual answer for that. The Lord is the only one who can provide for our deepest needs. The Lord is the only one who can fight our battles that frighten us the most. And that is what we need to know, and that is what we need to believe. Every other God that we could choose to serve takes. It takes your time. It takes your effort. It takes everything from you. But with God, you realize that all the time that you have, any of the blessings that you have, were given to you by Him in the first place. And so the best thing that you can do is give it back to Him, because it's what He deserves. He is the gift. He is the answer to all of our deepest problems. And so as we zoom out from this text in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see that God gives Israel exactly what they ask for. Just in the next few short verses, Saul comes along. And Saul is described as this great, tall guy. And what happens at the first time when a real battle faces them? When Goliath happens, the Israelites were wanting a king to go out before them and fight our battles. Does Saul do that? No. He cowers back. And so God gives Israel what they ask for in Saul. And it doesn't go the way that they think it will go. And so God gives Israel who they don't deserve in David. Now, David wasn't perfect, but we know that in the Bible he is described as a man after God's own heart. Genesis points to the need for an offspring who will crush evil and redeem creation, and the Lord provides. Exodus points to the need for a deliverer, and the Lord provides. Leviticus points to the need for a better sacrifice, and the Lord provides. Numbers points to the need of faithful guidance through the wilderness, and the Lord provides. Deuteronomy points to the need of a better covenant, and the Lord provides. Do you see how all of these are pointing ahead? Joshua points to the need for a greater rest, and the Lord provides. Judges points to the need for a righteous king, and the Lord provides. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles point to the limits of human leadership and the need for a perfect and eternal King. And the Lord has provided. From the moment of our text this evening onward through most of the rest of the Old Testament, Israel reaches some new high points under David and Solomon. In fact, it seems like in Solomon, all of the promises that God made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 are coming true. They're a great nation. They're living in the land. They're blessing all nations. But it is short-lived. Before time passes too long, they reach some new lows as well. Israel's need then is our need today, and that need is for the one man who fills our deepest need. And that man was God's own Son, and his name is Jesus. The Lord provides. He has provided an eternal, true, righteous King, and we have no need to serve other gods. He is the answer to the security, the comfort, the power, the approval that we all so deeply crave. He is the answer, and that answer is found in Jesus. If you feel the need to respond to the message this evening, I'd encourage you to come forward while we stand and while we sing.